Welcome to Designing Cities for All, another episode, and it's part of our 2-year-long activity and research program,
where we take a deep dive into designing products, spaces, and systems for all. Just because you feel safe, or you feel welcome, or you feel included, doesn't mean that everyone else around you feels the same way.
We don't stand alone. We're not individuals that somehow a planet or an island, you know?
And I think that's the beautiful thing of a diverse society, that everyone can add something from out of their own experience.
Things won't change just if we just let things happen.
I think if you can build relationships and use design as a tool to build those relationships, the better off we're all going to be.
Everything around us was once designed and can therefore be redesigned.
Belonging is a very, very important concept.
You can try to take someone's place for a while, but you don't have the lived experience.
Let's begin by acknowledging similarity and affinity.
Be a person, not your role.
I think inclusion is not a choice.
Inclusion happens by design or not at all.
In order to create truly inclusive public spaces that are accessible to everyone, we have to underline what everyone actually is.
Real inclusion, it's got nothing to do with the norm, but it's like something that we create from all different perspectives.
You know, so even when we bring everybody at the table, does everybody's voice count the same?
Because it's a big question of who tells these stories.
You know, the more I explore about other cultures, other religions, is the more ingredients I have to make the architecture and to answer the questions I get from society.
Not fitting in was a blessing, or I would have turned out just like you.
Welcome, everybody. You just saw the wrap-up of the first year of the social design Designing Cities for All of Us from the last year. It's actually a wrap-up of 5 fellows. And today we have here as our guests the 6th fellows, which is the Chrononauten, Edwin Gardner, Christiaan Fruneaux. Can I have a warm applause for them? So now the evening has started. My name is Indira van 't Klooster. I will host this evening in a very, very moderate way because the floor, of course, is all yours. The program series reflects on the matter of redesigning inclusive cities. 6 fellows have been invited to curate part of the program. And the Chrononauten, which we are not allowed to call the Chrononauts, I think. So Chrononauten it will be for tonight. Are futurists, philosophers, architect Edwin Gardner and Christiaan Fruneaux. They are time travelers, back and forth in time, and invite you to do the same and do or think along with them. In the Atlas of the Long Now, they try to practice what they call historic futurism, looking back 1,000 years and forward 100. They investigate the interactions between culture and technology and how these shape our relation with nature, each other, and ourselves. In their fellowship, they will rethink the shape of trust and democracy in the digital age. This evening, we'll get to know the ideas and work of the Chrononauten better. Also, we will dive into the topic of their fellowship, architectures of trust. In the work of the Chrononauten, trust is important. We need to rethink the shape of trust in both institutions and between people, especially in our society today, in which polarization, decreasing trust in institutions, and mis- and disinformation are the order of the day. So, after the presentation, we will have a short after-talk with Edwin and Christiaan about the fellowship and the ideas, where they came from and where they will go to. Edwin, I understood it is allowed to interrupt and to ask questions while you're presenting the lecture, right? Okay, so feel free to do so if you want to know something in more detail, if you have a question, if you want to add something. You're really sure that you want that, Edwin?
Yeah, very
good. And also, as we are not here by ourselves only in this venue, there are also people online watching with us. And if you want to join or ask a question, you can go to www.menti.com and then insert the code 8543 8545. 8543 8545. So, and if you're in the room, you simply raise your hands, of course. Edwin, the floor is yours. And a warm applause again, please. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everybody, for coming. So Pakkas de Zwijger invited us for their fellowship, Designing Cities for All. And we wanted to investigate the future of trust, and more specifically, the architectures of trust. And what we mean by that, I'll dive into that and explain that. So, yeah, perhaps without further ado, I'll do that and we'll explore more about what the Chrononauts, it's okay to say Chrononauts, and with the Atlas of the Long now, what we do and what the project is all about. But the last year, let's say the issue of trust, societal trust, and how it's so dysfunctional nowadays, has been really something we thought about and have been thinking and researching a lot, and especially also not just how it's dysfunctional, how to analyze the problem, but also we have some ideas or let's say design principles of perhaps how we could fix some of the issues. And that's also what we want to explore in the fellowship, are some principles and ideas that we thought up as a kind of scenario, but yeah, which is basically a conversation piece. So nothing is set in stone. Also what I'm presenting today, so if you have a question or a remark, like raise your hand and we'll talk about it. So let's go. I have to put it on maybe first. Yes. Where do I need to point? Yes. Okay, so to introduce this, basically a lot of the same arguments I'm going to present in the talk, I've also talked about and we've written about in this essay, Building Trust in the Electric Age, which is an introductory essay to this series. But let's start. We'll start with Jake Angeli Jansley. And I don't know, does anybody know who this is? The shaman, exactly. He is the QAnon shaman. And in this, costume, he became world famous during the 6th of January 2021, when a mob stormed the Capitol in Washington. And now, well, here we go. And the next slide. He was convicted recently by a judge for 41 months in prison. And the judge said this about it. So Chansley posted vitriolic messages on social media encouraging his thousands of followers to expose corrupt politicians, to ID the traitors in the government, to hold their agenda, to stop the steal and end the deep state. Well, most of you will probably read some conspiracy-like sentiments in this quote. And of course, you can read in it the dynamics of where a lot of social discourse is happening these days. And not just in the US. This problem has basically spread all over the world, and we've seen it a lot, of course, with the pandemic. So finding truth online isn't easy, and it's easy to get lost. And also the suspicion to a lot of the traditional institutions. Oh man, slideshows get going a bit faster than yeah. So yeah, there's a lot of suspicion towards, let's say, the traditional media institutions, towards experts, scientists, professionals. So a lot of, let's say, the people and bodies in which we've put a lot of trust as societies, we are now suspicious about. Or at least large parts of society are suspicious about them, which makes, of course, coming to a kind of consensus in our public sphere much harder. And also and it's not just anecdotal. Also, there's been a lot of research. So these are just 3 recent reports into, the low trust in society we have nowadays. And one of them comes out every year. This is the famous Edelman Trust Barometer. And just to pick one page from their report, here you can actually see that a lot of democracies in the last couple of years are suffering from low trust. So the US has been in the red for a while now, but Holland, which is like traditionally a high trust society, has kind of shifted from a trustworthy society into the neutral, and Germany has actually shifted out of the neutral zone into the red. And here you also see kind of the biggest losers, which are all democracies, Western and even an Asian democracy, and the countries which are gaining are authoritarian countries. So something's off, at least as far as Western democracies are concerned. So trust is a pretty big deal because, at least in our opinion, that is really what sticks societies together. So without trust, basically, societies start to crumble. Our organizations don't work anymore. Basic interactions don't work anymore in social life. So something needs to be done. And it has, apparently this crisis in trust we're seeing today has something to do with the media landscape we live in today. So this was put also in front of the Capitol a couple of weeks after January 6th by Some of Us, an online activism platform, which basically said, yes, the QAnon shaman, maybe this other shaman, Mr. Zuckerberg, also has something to do with this situation. So what we started to explore is this link. The link between societal trust, information technology, the experience of community, the scale of human cooperation that's possible in a particular society. So I think, so the information technology link, I think it's obvious probably also for a lot of you. But also what's a very important component of our way of looking at it is that the public sphere is where culture and, let's say, a sense of common community is generated. So in a big country or because you don't meet each other on a village square anymore. So somehow producing community happens in the public sphere. It happens in media landscapes. And when that starts to be unhealthy and doesn't function anymore, also your sense of commonality and being a community starts to erode. So this is, of course, something which eventually is very harmful for a society. And then finally, human cooperation. So not just agreeing on what is true is important, but also how do you work together? Like in a big corporation or in a country, thousands or millions of people have to somehow do stuff in a coordinated fashion. If there's no trust, how do you coordinate complicated things together? So to kind of give you guys a frame of thought, a kind of conceptual framework of how to think about this situation, I'm going to give you a very condensed history of what we call the architectures of trust. And this history goes from the spoken word to the printed word to today, the age of the activated word. So let's start. The spoken word, that's, let's say, the pre-modern dominant information technology. Of course, there was a written word, handwritten word, but the printed word wasn't really there yet. So the dominant technology was the spoken word, because a very small elite could actually read and write, and most of the people had to trust each other face to face and by their word. And to connect a couple of concepts to this, to how this world worked and how trust was organized. So the kind of, let's say, labor ethos was fealty. So you were loyal to your chieftain, to your lord, or even to God. But basically everything came down to your loyalty to another person, and usually a superior from a family. So the kind of organizational logic was also blood ties or tribes or family or clan-like structures. This is how trust was organized and secured. And the way to find truth wasn't, let's say, through our, what today, of course, we value objectivity as a way to kind of say, okay, we all agree that this is true. Very often, to establish truth, other methods were used. So trial by oath, trial by battle, and then basically fate would decide to agree on a truth on some kind of matter. So when somebody accused somebody else of having murdered their cousin, if they couldn't come to an agreement what had actually happened, you would just do another battle, and the battle would decide the truth. And so this results in a very kind of different, let's say, archetypal human. We've called this the Homo Nobilus. And this is, let's say, a human which operates from a very magical and subjective worldview. So a very different kind of person than you would meet today probably on the street. But something happened between, let's say, this reality on the left and where we are today. And we've coined this as the Gutenberg Age, so named after the person who supposedly invented the printing press, Mr. Gutenberg. And a couple of things changed. So in this period, a kind of new society with new kinds of values and ways of organizing emerged. So which started with the printing press. So the printing press made information much cheaper, much faster, and much easier to scale. And also it made it, let's say, much harder to tamper with, because once it was printed and reproduced, you couldn't change that printed reality so easily. And just imagine how much cheaper, let's say, if to copy a book before the printing press, let's say a monk would spend a year to copy a Bible. So imagine that you have to pay a year's income to buy a book. So let's say it was 50,000 euros to buy a book. And now, of course, you can buy a book for 10, 20, 30 euros. So that's a big change of value. And of course, newspapers, etc., this is much faster and very scalable. But also a kind of new group of people emerged. So it was the rise of the citizenry class, or the bourgeoisie. So an urban culture, which became a literate population. They were a reading culture. They started to read, and a kind of new dynamic, economic dynamism, and a kind of public sphere emerged out of that. Because if everybody read, everybody formed opinions about it, and they started to talk about this, or exchange books, or write each other letters, which resulted in an informed public, or even a public, because the kind of thing which we nowadays talk about as a public basically didn't exist in the Middle Ages. So the public was a new thing which emerged in modernity. And this public was a much bigger group than you could fit in a hall or a room and address with your voice or in one meeting. It emerged out of periodicals, newspapers, magazines, books, and of course almost towards a population where practically everybody could read. So there was an entirely new information domain that emerged. And when people informed themselves, they read, they also became politically engaged. So they were not just readers, they were also voters. So a whole new dynamic between the public sphere and how decisions were made and how political rule worked started to emerge. And also new ideas about power emerged. So also the idea of popular sovereignty. So not that, this god or king, which of course was also connected to this idea of fealty, was where the political power needed to lie. It was the people themselves. So the peoples were, in that sense, stood higher in power than their rulers, because they could vote them out of power. And of course, connected to that, also kind of new communal identity involved. So nationalism or the nation, this idea kind of came into being in the 18th, 19th and 20th century, connected to this emerging new form of government, the Democratic Republic. And of course, to participate in this new world, you needed to go to school. Because of course, you can imagine if today you couldn't read or write or couldn't do any math, it would be very hard to participate in society nowadays. So basically, education is a prerequisite to be part of a literate society. You have to, let's say, internalize the information technology to be able to be a citizen in this kind of world. So, we went from the Middle Ages now to, let's say, a world that's much more familiar to most of us. And also these kind of core concepts changed. So fealty made place for a new kind of idea, professionalism. So not people who swore loyalty to a lord, but basically who pledged loyalty to, let's say, their profession, to a code of ethics of their profession. So think of the scientist or the doctor or the lawyer. They basically are loyal to the code of ethics that is, let's say, embodied in their profession. So also new kinds of ways to secure this trust came into being. So from the family, it became institutions. So schools, universities, or councils, or associations. Of course, all these professions have their own boards or councils, which again check if people are following the ethics of their profession. But also, of course, stock exchanges are checked, or markets, or like if the food in the supermarket is eatable or not. So we have this whole ecosystem of authorities and institutions which make us trust the water we drink and the food we eat and the stocks we trade. And also kind of new idea how to establish truth. So it wasn't fate or it wasn't strange rituals which determined who was right or what was really had happened. We get objectivity and rationality. So if you could measure it, if you could objectively verify it. And we just actually wrote a little piece about it, the culture of fact. So a lot of people think this emerged with the Enlightenment and the scientific method, but it's actually earlier, it emerged in the courtroom. So people started to use new kinds of rules and methods to establish truth. So not by weighing somebody or seeing if they would drown. Hey, so you are a witness. So how close were you? Did somebody else see the same thing when we interrogate them objectively? So this new idea of fact, which was based on these ideas, kind of emerged from the early courtrooms of modernity. And also a kind of new archetype emerged out of that. Not this kind of magical, subjective human being, but a very objective, materialistic and deterministic human being. And it's not, it's all a way how, let's say, the Homo economicus looks at the world, but it's also an internal view. So how people started to look at themselves as materialistic, mechanical kind of machines in a way.
Edwin, before you go on, because this is a really, really dense
yes.
Walk through time, I want to check in with the audience. Is somebody, does somebody want to ask a question or to verify? Or you're all completely in sync with this story?
Yes.
Then go on, Edwin.
Okay. Then we make the second leap. The Turing Age. So Alan Turing, the inventor of the computer. So we basically named the age after their inventors. We get the new age, the activated words. So, of course, the new thing of this where the spoken word could, of course, only travel within physical social contexts. The printed word could travel far beyond this. But the new quality of the activated word is, of course, which is very magical, actually, is language that is alive. Language that can actually do something without humans putting labor into it. So if you put computer code in a computer, it can actually do something all on itself, which is, of course, a kind of magic in its own right. And this emerged with the invention of the computer by Alan Turing. And the computer, again, made a quantum leap in the speed, the density of processing and distributing information. And it also brought new classes or a new dynamic. So the emergence of this technology enabled, again, a kind of new economic dynamism and new platforms where, a kind of this public domain was extended. Somehow it was radically enlarged in terms of scale and information, but also in who could join, who could talk, who could publish on this platform. Some even call it the fifth estate. So with the trias politica, you have the traditional three. The fourth would be journalism, the media institution. And the fifth, you could say, are a kind of sphere where the people themselves have direct access and can exchange ideas and information. So a new kind of population emerges, not just a literate population, but a population who's continuously online, continuously connected to, in principle, all the information that exists. If you don't know something, you can basically look it up, and you can instantly comment on it, share it, participate. So we have a well-informed digital public domain, but it's also still a wild frontier where basically anybody can say anything. So it's hard to find the facts, to be objective in this new space. And it's run by commercial interests to a large degree. So there's people manipulating how this space works, which don't have, let's say, objectivity and truth as their first principle. And, well, this is a bit more speculative. So if popular sovereignty was the kind of new idea that emerged with the printing press, maybe individual or local sovereignty emerges today. At least I see a link between like this new debate around inclusivity and diversity, that more and more people, and not just people, also, let's say, nature maybe should have rights. So this kind of circle of inclusion is enlarged. And we're looking how can not just the majority of the people rule, but how can we also acknowledge all these individual differences, this big spectrum of life. And school is maybe not enough, or school has to change, or maybe we have to go even longer. We need longer educations to be able to navigate such a complex society. So let's say skills with digital technology or understanding how to work with it become a critical asset to be able to navigate such a society. So let's say digital literacy becomes required. Yeah.
But thank you. You mentioned in this digital era the ease of manipulation. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying that I disagree with you, but I was a bit surprised that it came up now, when you could also argue that in the era of a printed word, you have a very limited amounts of sources, let's say. If we are talking about newspapers, you perhaps would have one for the left, one for the right, and one for the middle, and that was your source of information. So I was wondering why the manipulation came in this age of them all.
No, it's a very good point. And you could even argue, of course, the manipulation also existed with the printed press, of course. But perhaps it was less visible to us because we somehow trusted the newspaper or trusted the professional. But how they actually operated was, of course, also invisible. What I think is maybe new is the scale of the manipulation. If you have, let's say, one newspaper in one country, or I mean, let's say here you have billions of people on the same platform being run by the same kind of algorithm. So I think manipulation is not unique now. It was also there, especially the earlier you go with the printing press. It was also Wild West with copying and fake news, etc. But I think what's really new now is the scale of the manipulation that is possible. So yeah, and also not just the scale in how many people you can reach, also the granularity at which you can actually target and manipulate very specific demographics of the population. So the scale and scope, I think that's the radically new thing for this era. Okay, so and this also, let's say, has some impact on these categories. This is a bit more speculative because, let's say, we're in this moment, so it's always tricky to kind of claim historical things about history that hasn't happened yet. But let's say from professionalism, a kind of new ethos of labor is emerging. We call it mastery. So it's not, let's say, the kind of professional framework you need to comply with is what's most important, and to be objective within this, but kind of being more, trusting yourself and your peers, and kind of looking at how you can be the best at what you do. But it's a more, let's say, personal relationship. The kind of institutions need to evolve to kind of digital identities. So maybe these kind of institutions trying to protect these things are not enough. I'll dive a bit more into this later. Also, trying to, let's say, one of the problems with objectivity, like through this fashion and in this constellation, is that we still have to trust the professionals. So you have to trust the newspaper or the doctor, let's say any kind of expert or professional, that they know the right thing to do and that they are acting according to their code of conduct, so to speak. But now everybody can look everything up. Oh, do I need a COVID vaccine or not? Oh, there's some other information. So this kind of trusting an authority kind of becomes very hard when everybody has access to information and can find either facts they like or maybe very good facts that are contradictory to what the authorities say. So you kind of need a kind of deeper level of objectivity that's kind of based in data and not just people with an education. And also here a kind of new, let's say, archetype emerges, which is in a way very contradictory to this kind of digital infrastructure, because it's a much more subjective and meaning-seeking individual. But they still have to navigate a world that's very much still based on, of course, a lot of complicated technology, and which still needs a lot of this objectivity. So there's a kind of tension there.
Edwin, could mastery also be agency?
Agency?
Yeah, as in who's entitled to say something?
Yes, I think so. So just like here with the other, let's say, labor ethoses, these would also entitle you to, if you have something to say, or if people would trust something that you say. So in that sense, the more mastery you have, or the better you are at your craft, would give you a higher status or a higher authority to say, well, of course, something about a specific topic that's in which you have mastery. I don't know if that answers the question, but...
Well, if mastery is only about crafts, then it does. But if it's also about experiences, for example, which is maybe also relevant today, or background...
Do you have an example?
You know today's debate in society, right? The whole concept of agency is that not everybody can speak for everybody, and sometimes you are entitled to say something or to know something, and sometimes you're not. So, but that's not necessarily about crafts. That can also be about history, culture, experience. Can be about anything. So is this schedule only about crafts or also about experiences? Also, when it leads to the Homo romanticus, let's say. So it looks like it's going to be a bit more emotional or a bit more personal, and also and then opposed by digital and by data. Could that be? Or maybe I'm just complicating things too much, and I'll just leave you to your lecture.
It's definitely, I think, another layer of this stack. But I think, in a way, let's say emotional literacy. So in a way to how can you talk about that, I think is very much part of the Homo romanticus and also craft, because it's not something you can, let's say, fix in a protocol or a procedure or something standardized and universal. So I think that maybe comes close to what you're going at, but maybe we can dive into that in the conversation. And yeah, and what the interesting thing is, so you can see these as historic periods where one happened after the other, but you can also see them from, let's say, top to bottom. So you could say the world of the spoken word is, of course, also still with us. I'm doing it right now. The printed word is still here, and the activated word is a kind of new layer added on top of this. So let's say all these values and ways of being in the world are existing next to each other, and they're not evenly distributed. So you could say this idea of fealty is very much alive in Putin's Russia. The printed word is still very much the world we live in today. I mean, it's still very institutional. You need documents for everything. So it's very much a world based on bureaucracy. So the logic of the desk with papers and protocols. So this is still the dominant, let's say, information technology, even though this one is clearly very influential as well. But all our institutions are still kind of in this layer. Our politics are basically the kind of the foundation of our societies are very much still in the logic of the printed word. But to maybe tell a little bit more of the, let's say, the moment where we are now. So how is the web developing? How is the digital world developing? Where are we now, and where could we go? So we'll get a bit closer to the architects, the architectures of trust, and how they should change. So first of all, if my digital technology doesn't abandon me, let's say you could roughly define a couple of phases of how the web developed. So the first one, you could say, is the experimental phase. It was the 90s, and the kind of the basics were built. So HTML, TCP, like how to get on the internet, your email. Was the first web, and it was mostly read. So most people went on there to read something, to consume something. It wasn't like a radically interactive experience. Then after the 2000s, Web 2.0, the social web, the share economy emerged. And this was also a new phase. We'll call it the wild web and the rise of the digital economy. So the first one was mostly the installation phase. So everybody got on. Nobody really knew how to make money with it yet. You had all the startups and, of course, the first bubble. But in the second phase, Mark Zuckerberg and some other people figured it out, how to make lots of money with the internet. And, of course, you got platforms, apps, the app stores, kind of marketplaces and advertising spaces where people figured out how to make money. And it was a read-write. So suddenly we could chat, we could comment, we could like, we could, etc. So it became two-way traffic. So today, this is, of course, government, the EU, the US are now talking about how to kind of address the problem of big tech, how to give them rules, break them up, etc. So there is a kind of end coming to the Wild West phase, at least. But the question is, what comes afterwards? So in, let's say, Silicon Valley, and let's say the programmers are talking about Web3. And this is more the future, so this is very speculative. And let's say the technologies are crypto, blockchain, a lot of hype around it and scams. So you can be very, let's say, suspicious of a lot of these things. But what is interesting about it is they're experimenting with new forms of digital ownership, how to do digital transactions. So it's kind of a laboratory to solve a problem, how to, let's say, own. How do you own something which can be fundamentally copied and, of course, in the digital scarcity doesn't intrinsically exist? And what if you could? So that's what a lot of the Web3 is about. But it also has an additional layer, smart contracts. And if you can have a contract, maybe you can vote, maybe you can govern something. So you get kind of the first toolbox for, maybe how to run a society and how to make protocols to make decisions together or to organize stuff. I mean, it's still very technical, mostly. I mean, the nerds are working on it. But they are also the ingredients for building institutions. And I don't know, who would say they really know how a blockchain works? We have one hand, that's very brave. Just to have a simplified explanation of, let's say, how it could work, I want to present you to a certain individual. Most of you have a computer or a smartphone. On it you have like a browser or you have apps, which you could say is your interface with the web, right? This is still pretty basic. Then you need a lot of passwords. So if you go to Facebook, you need your username, your email, you go to the app or the browser, and you can enter the big Facebook server. And you get access, and then on your device you are able to enjoy the Facebook world. And this goes for every possible app. So for Google it's the same. For anybody who wants to try something new, they have to also do this whole thing. And of course here in the colors you see, this is also their power basis. Because here's all your data, all your pictures, all the interactions is on their server. And you access it with their passport, basically. So this is a problem because it's all there. So the new world that's being proposed by Web3, or you could say this kind of distributed databases. So this is basically the same. How would Facebook or Google work in the new Web3 world? Still you have your computer, still you have apps, but there's a new thing. It's called a wallet. It's kind of can be a plugin to your app or a browser, but it's basically just a way to log in. So still, and you have a new data. So Facebook has lost their database. All their data is now in a big communal distributed database, not owned by a private, one private party. So you have one address way to log in through the wallet, and you can access it. Basically, you say Facebook may access my data on this public distributed infrastructure. It's not owned by Facebook. You can only say you can get this access to it or not. And it results in an app or Facebook to be basically just an interface. So and that radically also changes the position for the newcomer, because suddenly, all they have to do is design a very good interface, and if the people allow access to the data, they suddenly can communicate with each other. So it's a bit like, of course, now a Facebook person cannot communicate with a Twitter person, but with our phones we can do that. If somebody has T-Mobile and the other one has KPN, we can call each other, right? And that's more the world we would like to go to have a kind of common data infrastructure where you're not like siloed in, but basically everything can communicate with each other. So for instance, you have a digital passport that lets you log in, and the database says, okay, you can enter my access my data. And you can also say you can't anymore, and then basically, yeah, it's still there, and Facebook has nothing to do with you. So how does this all translate back to our problem of the public sphere? So just, let's say, the basics. So the idea or the word public sphere was first coined by Jürgen Habermas, and he said it's made up of private people gathered together as a public. So still you can see this is a kind of a new thing, a public. So these private people together are a public. So you had to kind of make that clear. And articulating the needs of society with the state. And the kind of image he had with it was like the coffee house. So these kind of new spaces that emerged in urban cultures where people would come together and exchange opinions, and all these people could read the newspaper. So this was kind of a new sphere to form opinion. And he also had some criteria for this public. So it's for the formation of public opinion. Everybody should be able to access it. Conference in unrestricted fashion about matters of general interest which imply freedom from economic or political control. So it should be a free space, no commercial interests manipulating what's going on there. Debate over the general rules governing relations. So there we can discuss how should we govern, what are the right rules and laws for our community. So we thought this definition doesn't really cut it anymore for our current, let's say, media sphere we live in. So this is our new definition. A public sphere produces public trust by imbuing information technology with a measure of objectivity, a notion of truth that is independent from human subjectivity. This measure of objectivity is called the architecture of trust. It enables the alignment of individual norms, identities, and interests into a sense of common ownership, which provides the safety needed for the people to cooperate. So somehow this new public sphere, this kind of measure of objectivity should be integral part of how we do business in it. We cannot just like leave it to people and institutions. Our world has become too complex to solve it in that way, we think. So we also made some criteria which the public sphere, according to us, would be ideal if it would follow these kind of design principles. So the design principles for a healthy digital public sphere would be a public sphere should be secure and transparent, universally accessible domain where objectively verified information sources can be made public, so that matters of public concern can be discussed by recognizable members of the community in a way that promotes consensus. So there's some new ones. So yeah, recognizable members of a community. Let's say if you meet in a coffee house, this is not the first thing you think about as being a problem. Being on a social media platform, you might think that's a condition you should have before you start talking with somebody. So some of these, of course, are all like matters of public concern. Let's say that's the same, but we needed some extra, let's say, criteria because, yeah, it's the digital public sphere and it works differently. So just some examples of what this could look like, and these are also the themes we're going to explore in the triptych in the 3 sessions we'll do in November. So the first one is the public domain. So it's basically about how do we establish what is true? Because that's, of course, one of the, let's say, tasks of a public sphere, is to somehow agree. What do we find true? So, for instance, to compare, let's say, a traditional media institution, journalistic institution, the NOS, when you see an article there, often it has no author. It has no links to sources or for you as a reader to verify claims in the article. So basically you have to trust the let's say, the journalistic professionalism of the NOS institution. If you don't, you basically have no recourse. You cannot check anything. So you have to trust them. If you compare something like that to a kind of new way of doing journalism, for instance, Bellingcat, which is, they sometimes call it open source intelligence. So basically, They use all kinds of sources which can be found online openly, and collaboratively they basically verify different sources, put it together, but you can kind of retrace their entire chain of evidence. So how can you, let's say, determine that this is on this place in the map? So it's a completely transparent kind of truth-finding process. This is the second session. We want to talk about public culture. So how do we engage in online social discourse? So basically, how do we treat and talk with each other online? So one of the problems online is that some people are anonymous. They are not using their real name. They're not using their real profile photo. And these are some scientific studies which basically show if you're not recognizable, you're much more likely to misbehave. So like the fighting, the calling names, the hoaxes, everything that we now associate with bad behavior online is very much connected to this kind of anonymity. So often when people get directly in touch, via direct messages or without, let's say, the public watching and being anonymous, a much more frank, much more civil discourse seems to happen. So how can you still protect privacy and identity, but at the same time be recognizable in certain contexts where public opinion is formed? Because, talking with masked people in real life and not knowing it would be very weird, but online it happens all the time. But it also has another side. We can also be more anonymous in certain conditions than we are now. Sometimes we're oversharing. So one example would be, for instance, if you buy liquor at a liquor store, maybe the clerk is doubting if you're 18 or not and asks your ID. And then you show your picture, your date of birth, the place you were born, your social security number, all kinds of information he doesn't really need, because the only thing he needs to know, do I need to give this bottle this person or not? So for instance, if you compare the Corona app, it doesn't say anything. It just says you're allowed in or not. So also the clerk doesn't even need to know your age. They just need to know this contextual information. Should I give this person alcohol or not? And then finally, the last session will be about public governance. So how do we, how would democratic culture evolve? How will this change governance? So this is more tapping into, of course, all this new discourse. Started with David van Rijbroek and now recently with Eva Rovers about burgerraden, or could a lottery system or a third chamber in our democratic institutions work? So could you kind of combine these new ways of governing, moving from a representational democracy towards a participatory democracy? How could that be supported also by new kinds of infrastructure, new kinds of digital infrastructure? They're building it in this kind of Web3, but there's just a technological solution. But it also needs a kind of new culture. So we want to explore how these two could come together. So that's what we have in mind for our 3 sessions in November. Well, that's it for now for me.
Well, thank you, Edwin. Round of applause for Edwin. And of course, Christiaan too. You're the one presenting, but of course, it's a communal effort. Any questions already from the audience? Something you would like to know, ask? Yeah, the microphone is coming to you.
Thank you. It's very obvious that there's a lot of polarization happening around the world. And my question would be around the public sphere. If you would design a public sphere in most places around the world, take United States, you would actually probably have 2 public spheres with 2 sets of data, with 2 sets of people that believed in the data, that are coming to a conclusion that is the exact opposite of the other group, right? So facts never lie, but all lies use facts. So we've seen the emergence of an organization called QAnon, which is very hard to believe how people can believe in such irrational behavior, right? So, and that brings me to the model that I was a little surprised that you, after the rationality of the rationality of that you use data. Because to me, there's, what happens is that there's a certain kind of irrationality happening because everyone can prove their point with data now, which is not the case before. There's so many data that you can prove everything, and it's exact opposite. And so my question would be, are you not concerned that there's going to be really two polarized public spheres or multiple polarized public spheres happening if you apply this?
Maybe Christiaan, for you, as we haven't heard you yet, you're fresh in the game.
Yeah, I think it's more about what Edwin told us about the chain of evidence. I mean, if we have a disagreement and you cite one expert who cites a bunch of facts and a bunch of research, and I read another expert who referenced another bunch of research. Both of us don't have access to the particular research. So we have both of us have second-hand information, and we're gonna spar with that. But I think what the data suggests is that you have a sort of public database that has the whole chain of evidence within it. So all scientific research is there. All the statistical analysis is there. All the journalistic sources are there. So if we disagree on, oh, you saw that expert and he tells you A, and I saw this expert that tells me B, we can just go immediately to, okay, what kind of sources do he references on? And we can compare it. So there is immediately a common frame of reference on which we can base the discussion. And I think that's what's lacking today. There is no transparency. There is just there's even no facts. There's just experts who tell you something, and you just have to trust them that their opinion is based on research that none of us sees. And I think what the data, what Edwin suggested with the data pictogram is that we sort of create this total transparent database of research and research sources, etc. So that people who aren't experts like us can just go into it and learn something and discuss it. But colleagues of them, peers, can recreate and control the efforts they made. I think that's what the common, if everybody has, let's say, a data vault or a data pod or a data wallet or whatever you call it, and you can put research in there or sources in there, authenticate it, verify it, etc. You have a totally different architecture of truth, basically. And I think what we suggest is if there is such a thing, after a while, culture is starting to change again, because hopefully we start to trust the public sphere again. Because we're going to recognize if we see, like, I don't know, you watch CNN and I watch Fox News, and we're starting to recognize, hey, this article is not linked to any research. Or the research it's linked to is debunked by this and this, or it's discredited by this, or it's still under discussion, or whatever. So there is a deeper layer that you can immediately access. And I think that's the scenario we're sort of exploring. Hopefully that answered your question.
Well, thank you for that question. I think it's a really interesting question because it also taps into the scheme that you described, with the let's say the trust in the Middle Ages, the trust in modern age, and let's say postmodernity as today, that there are actually so many levels of trust, but it was maybe much more kind of uniform earlier. Like there is trust in God, which is answered by belief. There is trust in science, which is answered by rationality. There is trust in law, which is answered by obedience, for example. But now there are so many kinds of trust, and we try, or we find our own sources. All the data are there. We can simply define our own definition of trust. So what is your definition of trust if it needs to answer all these different personal definitions that people have?
Do you want to have a go at that?
For the diversity of the sounds. Well, is it? Yeah, it's on. I think although maybe that sounds very diverse, I think there's also a lot of commonality still in there. I think, so we made these three, let's say, broad frameworks as three, let's say, basic broad frames of trust within which a lot of these, let's say, all these ideas of professionalism are basically, whether it's a doctor or a lawyer or an architect, they're basically operating on the same trust operating system. But you can see, I think, within a society that different groups have different trust cultures. So, for instance, if you have the less literate parts of society who can't read very well, so usually lower educated or lower income, yet there's also less trust in the experts and the professionals and let's say the literate trust architecture. They trust more family or friends or let's say more informal trust networks. So I think, if you look at different cultures also, I think, let's say in a place like the Netherlands, broadly speaking, it's still trusting in a lot of the institutional frameworks. But if you go to a place where the state doesn't work very well and that's corrupt, authorities or classical authorities are not trusted. So you trust in informal networks or family or friends or corruption as an alternative system of getting things done.
But then it's still again, what's the definition? Because you defined the definition of the architecture of trust. But what is trust? Is it belief, acceptance, safe
trust
spaces?
Is a sort of it's a sort of faith. You don't know if something is true. You don't know if something it's an expectation that something will happen, and you just surrender to it. So you trust your friend. You don't know if he will do the right thing or if he will do what you expect he will do, but you just surrender to the fact that you think he will. And I think that's the same thing with faith. You don't know if there is a God, but you just surrender yourself to the fact that you think there is. And I don't know if that's the correct definition, but there is something of a... I don't know if somebody here has a gun or if someone here, I don't know, will do something bad, but I just trust the situation. I surrender myself, but I have no objective ways of knowing. And I think that's what trust is.
So trust is personal.
It's very personal. It's very personal, and but it's very necessary for people to cooperate with each other. And it's very necessary for a society to function.
Can we have a microphone now?
Well, the preconditions or the conditions to be able to trust, that's a thing I'm missing here, because...
Well, I think that's what we're trying to do. I think the whole sort of historical picture Edwin painted it's a sort of taxonomy of trust, it's sort of architecture of trust. So you need a certain level of objectivity within the architecture of trust, which was given mostly by the professional. You trusted the professional to leave his partiality, to leave his subjectivity at home, and to just be what you wanted him to be. So that's part of what you need in an architecture of trust. You need a level of objectivity that everybody can relate to on the same level. Because it's a commonality, objectivity. It's a common frame of reference.
Actually, I think you defined the conditions for this kind of trust that you are defining now. Maybe we can have it on screen. We can find it, the 7 points of what do we need for a public sphere that we can trust, which was basically the definition of the internet in 1993. Isn't that true? Or did something change in between?
Well, I think the early internet was very much pioneering space. So I think anonymity was actually praised. So it was in that sense very opposite to this idea we should have recognizable members of the community, which we now say, yeah, that could be a good thing for a healthy conversation online. I think the early internet was very much celebrating you can be anybody who you want to be. You can reinvent yourself. You can use a different name. You can use a different avatar or identity. So I think that was very much a frontier and pioneering culture. And now that the digital sphere is becoming part of society proper, the pioneering culture doesn't work anymore. You cannot, let's say, it's not a place of complete experimentation anymore. No, we are buying stuff online. I mean, if you would ask somebody in the 90s, would you buy something online? Like, I have no idea. Maybe it won't arrive. Maybe he'll go away with my... You wouldn't trust it as a place of commerce yet. So it's gradually evolved. And now we're doing so much online. And we're also actually trusting a lot of things online already, as especially younger generations are doing everything.
So, but your fellowship is about regaining that trust, right, from the digital sphere. So,
yeah, if I can go back to the, is it on? Yeah, if I can go back to your earlier question, what is needed for societal trust? What we're talking about, I think it's that idea of a healthy public sphere, because a healthy public sphere produces communality. It produces community, and a broken public sphere fragments community, and it does so by how do you say that? Embedding the same values in every member of the public sphere to a certain degree, so that if you walk on the street, or if you go into a party, or if you are in a social setting, you have a certain expectation that everybody there shares some values that you also share. Those values that make you feel safe in that particular situation. And I think that is what a public sphere does. You go to Limburg, you don't know people in Limburg, you never met them. But you trust that they won't, I don't know, do something bad to you, because you trust that they have the same values as you. So...
Or maybe you're open to new experiences, or new bubbles, or new societies, or new
Of course,
communities.
but certain values you need. I mean, right? You need the value that they will cause you physical harm. You need the value that you trust them not to lie to you. Certain values you need. And within that safe zone, there can be all kinds of diversity. But I think that's also, a limit to diversity, because our society is so complex. You also need communality. And communality, they need some common denominators. It's very difficult to produce a society from people who say, I will kill everybody who come next to me. Yeah, that's just me. I'm the way I am, and this is me. I just go for it.
Yeah,
and they're like, oh, just go for it, but I'm not coming near you.
Okay, but
I don't want anything to do with you.
But that kind of communities exist. So how do you get them back into the public or the digital sphere?
No, those kind of communities don't exist. They die out very fast.
but they won't kill each other. Anyway, there's a question in the audience. Let's
Yeah, thank you.
deeper.
I was kind of stuck with what Edwin said before about like some parts of community still exist on the family base, the trust of value, partly because of illiteracy and stuff like that. If you go to the digital framework, even more people can't get along with it. So how do we get to the third point of your list, universal accessibility? Because it seems to me like you got 3 layers and the third one gonna be more elitist than the others.
Well, I still have the micro. It's going to be more complex. So society is going to be more layered and complex. And yeah, just like the spoken word is still very powerful. That's in politics, the spoken word, rhetorics, it's still very important. Look at Boris Johnson. I mean, he's very good rhetorically. And so you need that skill, right? To somehow, if you have that skill, the world is easier for you to navigate. And the same goes with the writing skill, and the same goes with the digital, producing digital texts. So I think you're right, and that's a very good question. How does this very layered informational society, how do you make it more accessible for people who can't, perhaps are not the best talkers, or are not the best writers, or are not the best coders, or education. But no, that's a very good question. It's becoming more complex. Also, with the archetypes that are still with us, we still have the Homo Nobilus in us. We still have the Homo economicus in us, and we still have, or we still becoming more Homo romanticus each day. And it's also like a shift from the Homo Nobilus was based on the search for physical safety. Economicus based on economic safety, and the Romanticus is based on emotional safety. It's just becoming more complex, and hence more difficult to navigate. So
and that
hence the fellowship.
Hence the fellowship, and hence also. So I think there's 2 sides to answer. So on the one hand, you have to help people get skills, so that the educational part of it. But I think you also need to help protect those who have a hard time, or are not able, or are marginalized, so that they don't become victimized by, I mean, you just have to recall the toeslagenaffaire to make the point. So all these systems, so toeslagenaffaire is a kind of combination of bureaucracy and digitization together, making like the worst possible outcome for a marginalized group in society. So I think,
and racism.
Yeah, that's true, and racism. Yeah, but if you just mark the technological stuff, but of course. But I think so there's both sides. You need to bring people along, and you need to protect, for whatever reasons, those who can't, and that's like a double challenge, of course.
I think part of the solution could be that such a layered society, you need more simplicity. So instead of, I think that's one of the interesting arguments for a thing like basic income. It's just so simple. Instead of all these bureaucratic toeslagen, these, I don't know what it is in English, these benefits you get in all possible situations and contexts, and the money just goes in and out of your bank account, and it's so complex. And I think one of the easiest way, like a basic income, it's super simple. Everybody gets this. Everybody gets a certain amount of economic safety, and that's about it. And stuff is free. And I think that's also what they, after the toeslagenaffaire, what they, I don't know if they continued it, but I think they're thinking about Just make the whole thing free.
But then are you also advocating a reconsideration of the whole economic system as we have it?
Well, I think digitalization will, just like the printing press rearranged society on a very fundamental level, I think digitalization will do the same, including the economic system.
But also in a way that becomes more accessible and more equal?
I think so. Yeah, if we make the right decisions, it can be so. Yeah.
But will we make the right decision?
Well, I think we will. Yeah, why not?
You are an historian by education, right? So how does history help you in designing this scheme, this research?
I think what people mostly don't realize about the Western modernity is that it's both technological progress, but it's also democratic progress. It's also a very much within Western modernity is a very much an emancipation force. Yes, it's there is capitalism and there is the search for knowledge, etc. But emancipation and democracy was very much also part of it. And when we didn't lose that, it's still going on. And I think much of the conspiracies that you see behind it is also a thirst for more equality and more transparency and things like that. So, yeah, I choose to be hopeful, and I choose to work towards a more equal, diverse, inclusive society. And I think those forces are at play.
I really like your optimism and your trust, basically, in a better society, right?
But there's also there's no alternative, right? What are you going to do? Just run away?
Yeah, well, yeah, it will go on like economic platforms now also just go on. So
but
it's not like we will go away if economics go wrong.
No, I think, but you go to I think the that's why Edwin and I also started with Monik. Well, we were at the Occupy movement, and everybody there said, "Oh, we don't like this, we don't like that. This is all very bad," and mostly we agreed. But we were also like, so how can we change it? What does a socially inclusive and sustainable society look like, and how do we get there, and how can we think about questions like that? And that's, yeah, we like the perspective of it, and we like. So that's why we started to think about how can you think about the future in a constructive manner, and that's where all these constructs come.
And that's probably also why the two of you get along so well, because your professional background is architecture, right? So you like building societies, I suppose. Can you explain a bit how architecture is helping your framework?
Yeah, well, I think as you say, like if you look at architects and urbanists and just a bit of architecture and urbanism history, you see like utopian thinking on city scale, right? Or like country scale. No lack of megalomaniac utopian projects in that space. So I think, yeah, of course, that's also what I got in my education. But I think what's interesting is, let's say, if we would really simplify it, maybe a designer or architect would think, I make a utopian form and utopian society will follow. My concrete will shape them into utopians, right? And I think the sociologist, Chris, would say, no, there's social stuff happening, there's culture happening, and those are the people who build the city, right? It's people first and they build stuff. And of course, it's, let's say, both perspectives are true. So there is some engineering. So, of course, technology, as we explained, does stuff. And of course, technology is also made by people. So it's also because a certain cultural environment or new, let's say, urban culture produces guilds and entrepreneurial types who start to make foundries and mix them with wine presses. Hey, a printing press, wow. So both are at work. And I think that's, if you look at the interplay between both those perspectives, I think then you get a more complete picture of what's going on.
So maybe, is there still a question from the audience? I'm also looking at the time. Because then there is maybe, question? Yeah, okay. Microphone is coming.
Question about the importance of algorithms. You pointed out that algorithms oftentimes now, and a lot of the opinions of people, of course, are driven by algorithms, are driven by economic pursuit, creating a confirmation of what you already think, and so you keep on seeing social media feeds that reinforce what you mean. So does that also mean that what you're trying to achieve here is that you almost like need algorithms that to achieve compromise that actually give you the opposite also once in a while, that give you maybe the data, but that I think that's very difficult, but that give you the opposite of what you actually believe. And would that be, and how would we achieve that?
Yeah, well, I think if you look at your timeline or your feed, of course they're engineered to provoke and or to, let's say, stimulate certain behavior and certain. So and of course these are economic values. They're profit-driven values. Why our engagement is shaped in the way it's shaped, and it can be differently. It's a design thing. So you can design it differently, and you can design it. So this is, let's say, the utopian concrete is the algorithm now. You can say, yeah, you can make it differently. You can make it conducive for consensus building, or you can make it conducive for truth seeking, or you make it.
What do you hope to find in the? Because now you have the fellowship, you have 3 events here. You have the book club. Internet for the people. What do you hope to find or to?
Well, I think we hope to. We have, let's say, kind of sketches of ideas, of ingredients which we think are needed for making a healthier digital public sphere. Yeah, we seek to refine them. We seek new insights, or we seek like maybe people pointing out this is a super bad idea and has a very good explanation why we have it wrong. So that's what we're looking for. So we're looking to better ourselves and our ideas in order to hopefully help.
And Christiaan, maybe you want to add something on that? What do you hope to find or to explore?
I think also what we found lacking in the whole debate on the wild web is that everybody points towards big tech, and the European Union is putting forth all these laws, very complicated laws, which is sort of in Dutch we say paniekvoetbal, and it's very much targeted at big tech, and we feel that big tech is not the right think frame to approach what is wrong with the public sphere. We think that you should say, oh, there is a public sphere, and what does it need to do? Oh, it needs to produce community. And what does it take for it to produce community? And then you have to implement that. You have to design yourself. You have to design the public sphere. And then big tech will have to adapt. And then we come to the question, now it's a symptom. Big tech, the fact that it's there and the fact that it does what it does, it's a symptom of a public sphere, a public domain that is fragmented, it has no rules. It's just a square where everything is possible and where the big guys dominate, the bullies dominate. And you can't just dominate the bullies back. You have to create a rule book, a digital rule book and based on what you need the public sphere to do. Well, we need it to produce communality.
And can I still ask a question?
A short comment on that.
Yeah, it does. Do you have examples of this reshaping from bottom up? is there? I mean, is it already information?
Well, there is the stack or the logic of Web3 that Edwin showed. I mean, we didn't invent that. That's just there's a lot of like more blockchain-based initiative working on it, but also a lot more commons-based initiatives working on it, who work more from a public logic, and obviously the blockchains, they work more from a transfer, or is it transactional logic from it. And there's European Union who just proposed a digital passport. And there's even Tim Berners-Lee, the guy who invented the World Wide Web. He's like, well, we need data vaults. So there's a whole spectrum of new initiatives that are recognizing this problem. But what we don't see as of yet is that they use the work public domain and what it needs to do. So and maybe we hope that we're curious to what that will do.
Well, that's basically what you're going to do, right? Because on November 7, it's about designing a public domain. On November 14, it's about constructing a public culture. And on 21st of November, it's about building a public governance.
Yeah.
So the aims are quite clear.
Yeah.
And we're going to follow you on how you're going to make this happen, to zoom out, to look ahead, and to gain insights. Thank you very much for being such a participative audience. Thank you very much for sharing your ideas on the fellowship and the kickoff and presentation, and we're looking very much ahead of it. I have a few announcements because there is a book club connecting to this fellowship, and the first book, there it is, Internet for the People by Ben Tarnoff. 3 more sessions, 2 book club sessions, and thank you very much for being here. Join everything, follow the Chrononauten, and looking forward to the next time. Thank you very much. Applause.